There are certain nights in history that entire communities agree never to speak of again. Nights so disturbing that generations later, the descendants still refuse to acknowledge what happened. In the cotton parishes of central Alabama there exists one such night, May 23, 1852, when the bodies of 17 people were discovered at the Yansy plantation before dawn. The local magistrate's report, sealed for 73 years, contained details so shocking that when it was finally opened in 1925, 3 historians immediately petitioned to have it resealed. What made this case particularly horrifying wasn't just the number of dead, but the carefully documented evidence suggesting that everything began with 2 sisters who should have been identical in every way, yet competed for the same man, a man they legally owned. Before we continue with the story of the Yansy twins and the night that would be known only as the catastrophe in whispered conversations for the next century, I need you to do something. If you're fascinated by the darkest corners of American history, the stories they tried to bury, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. And in the comments, tell me what state or city you're listening from. I want to know how far these forgotten stories are reaching. Now, let's uncover what really happened on that blood-soaked May night in Alabama. The truth about the Yansy plantation had been carefully hidden, but the evidence, court documents, personal letters, and testimonies from neighboring plantations tells a story far more disturbing than any legend. The Yansy plantation sat on 000 acres of prime cotton land along the banks of the Alabama River, just northwest of Montgomery. The columned mansion with its wraparound veranda and imported French windows represented everything the South aspired to be in those final years before the world would tear itself apart. The property had belonged to the Yansy family since 1798, passed down through 4 generations of men who built their fortune on cotton and the labor of the 143 enslaved people who worked the fields, the gin house, and the mansion itself. In 1848, when Cornelius Yansy died of cholera during an epidemic that swept through the Tennessee Valley, he left behind a peculiar inheritance situation that would become the talk of Montgomery society. His twin daughters, Caroline and Catherine, 23 years old and unmarried, inherited the entire estate in equal shares. Their mother had died giving birth to them, and Cornelius had never remarried, pouring all his ambitions into his daughters and his land. The twins were identical in appearance. Both had dark auburn hair they wore in elaborate braids, pale skin that required parasols, and wide-brimmed hats and green eyes that seemed to change shade depending on their mood. They stood 5 feet 7 inches in tall, unusually tall for women of their era, and their voices held the same soft drawl that could harden into command when addressing the enslaved workers or household staff. But where they were identical in appearance, they were opposites in temperament, a fact that everyone in Dallas County would eventually come to understand with terrible clarity. Caroline, born 23 minutes before her sister, had inherited their father's business acumen and his iron will. She kept the plantation books, negotiated cotton prices with factors in Montgomery and Mobile, and ran the estate with calculated precision. She attended the Methodist Church in Cahaba every Sunday, served on the Ladies' Auxiliary, and maintained all the proper social connections that kept a plantation functioning in Alabama society. Her ledgers were immaculate, her correspondence formal and precise, her reputation unblemished. Catherine, by contrast, had inherited something else entirely, a wild streak that polite society whispered about behind fans and over tea. She read scandalous French novels that she ordered from New Orleans, rode her horse alone through the countryside without a chaperone, and showed little interest in the marriage proposals that came regularly from sons of other plantation families. She spent hours in the gardens, claimed to find organized religion stifling, and often disappeared for long walks along the river. Where Caroline controlled, Catherine questioned. Where Caroline preserved tradition, Catherine pushed against boundaries. For 4 years after their father's death, this delicate balance held. Caroline managed the business, Catherine managed the household, and the Yansy plantation continued to produce its quota of cotton bales each season. The enslaved population worked the fields under the supervision of an overseer named Virgil Henley, a hard man from Georgia, who carried a whip and maintained discipline through fear and punishment, as was common on plantations throughout the Black Belt. But in the spring of 1852, something shifted in the careful equilibrium of the Yansy estate. It began, as these things often did, with something that seemed inconsequential at the time. On March 15, 1852, Caroline purchased a man at the Montgomery slave market. His name was Samuel, and he came with papers indicating he had been born in Virginia, sold south at age 19, and had spent the last 6 years working in the port of Mobile. He was 27 years old, stood 6 feet 2 inches in tall, and possessed what the auctioneer's bill of sale described as an unusually refined manner of speech and exceptional literacy. The last detail was what had caught Caroline's attention. Literate slaves were rare and valuable. They could manage complex tasks, keep records, understand written instructions. Caroline had been looking for someone to help manage the household inventories and assist with correspondence, particularly during the busy harvest season when her time was consumed with cotton calculations and shipping arrangements. She paid $1,200 for Samuel, a significant sum that raised eyebrows among other bidders. What Caroline didn't know, what no one knew until much later, was that Catherine had accompanied her sister to Montgomery that day and had seen Samuel on the auction block before Caroline made her bid, had noticed the way he held himself despite the degradation of being displayed for purchase, had observed his eyes, dark and intelligent, scanning the crowd with barely concealed contempt for the proceedings, had felt something she'd never felt before, standing in that crowd of men in black coats and women with parasols watching human beings sold like cattle. Samuel arrived at the Yansy plantation on March 18th. Virgil Henley wanted to send him to the fields immediately. Field hands were always needed, especially strong young men who could work from sun up to sundown, but Caroline overruled him. Samuel would work in the house. She insisted he would assist with correspondence, inventory management, and the complex record-keeping required to run an estate of this size. The decision caused immediate friction. Henley, who had run the Yansy plantation's labor force for 6 years with brutal efficiency, didn't trust educated slaves. They gave the others ideas, he argued. They caused unrest. But Caroline held firm. She owned half this plantation, and she would decide how her property was utilized. For the first 2 weeks, Samuel performed his duties exactly as expected. He was differential, quick to understand instructions, meticulous in his work. He helped Caroline organize shipping manifests, copied letters in a neat hand that suggested formal education somewhere in his past, and maintained the household inventory lists with impressive accuracy. He spoke only when spoken to, kept his eyes downcast in the presence of white people, and showed none of the insolence that Henley constantly warned about. But Catherine watched him from the windows of the upper floor, from the doorway of the drawing room, from her seat on the ver in the late afternoon. She watched the way he moved through the house, the way his jaw tightened when Henley barked orders, the way his hands, calloused but careful, held the pen when he wrote. She began finding excuses to be wherever he was working, asking questions about the inventory, requesting his assistance with moving furniture or retrieving books from high shelves. It was Catherine who first spoke to him as if he were a person rather than property. It happened on April 2nd in the library, where Samuel was cataloguing the contents of the Yansy book collection. Catherine entered, closed the door behind her, something she should never have done, something that violated every social code of the plantation south, and asked him a question that would change everything. "Can you read these?" she asked, gesturing to the shelves of books. "Or just copy the titles?" Samuel looked up, clearly uncertain how to respond. The question itself was dangerous. Admitting to full literacy could be seen as threatening. But something in Catherine's expression, genuine curiosity rather than malice, made him answer honestly. "I can read them, miss. My first owner's wife taught me when I was young. She was a Quaker from Pennsylvania who believed differently about such things." Catherine pulled a book from the shelf. Victor Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, a French novel that had recently been translated into English. "What's this one about?" And Samuel, in direct violation of every survival instinct that had kept him alive in a world designed to destroy him, began to tell her about Quasimodo and Esmeralda, about sanctuary and persecution, about the nature of true ugliness versus true beauty. Catherine listened, sitting on the edge of the library table, her elaborate day dress spreading around her like a flower, while an enslaved man spoke to her about literature and philosophy as if they were equals. This scene repeated itself over the following weeks. Catherine would find Samuel alone, ensure they wouldn't be interrupted, and they would talk about books at first, then about music, about the world beyond Dallas County, about ideas and dreams and thoughts that couldn't exist within the rigid hierarchy of plantation life. Catherine had never had conversations like these. Not with her sister, who thought only of profit and propriety, not with the searing sons of planters who courted her, not with anyone. For the first time in her life, someone listened to her thoughts as if they mattered, challenged her ideas, made her think beyond the boundaries of her privileged existence. For Samuel, these conversations were something else entirely. They were dangerous, potentially fatal. Every word he spoke was a risk. Every moment alone with a white woman was a threat. One accusation, one misunderstood gesture, and he would be killed. No trial, no questions, just a rope and a tree. He knew this absolutely. Yet he continued to meet with Catherine, continued to speak honestly with her, because in those stolen moments in the library or the garden house or the tack room of the stable, he could briefly exist as something other than property. By late April, their conversations had evolved into something that couldn't be called mere intellectual exchange. They had become intimate in ways that transcended physical touch, though that barrier, too, would eventually fall. Catherine found herself thinking about Samuel constantly, arranging her days around moments when she might see him alone, lying awake at night, replaying their conversations. For a woman raised in a society that taught her to see enslaved people as less than human, as tools or children incapable of complex thought, these feelings created a cognitive dissonance that she couldn't resolve. How could she feel this way about someone she was supposed to own? Caroline noticed the change in her sister, the distraction, the sudden interest in household management that brought Catherine into contact with Samuel more frequently. The way Catherine's mood would brighten when Samuel was present. At first, Caroline attributed it to boredom, to Catherine's restless nature finding a new curiosity. But Caroline was observant, meticulous in her attention to detail, and she began to watch more carefully. On May 1st, Caroline was working in the Plantation office, reviewing shipping contracts when she needed Samuel to verify an inventory count. She sent a housegirl to fetch him, but he couldn't be found. For 30 minutes, Samuel was unaccounted for. When he finally appeared, apologizing for the delay and explaining he'd been searching for a missing ledger in the attic storage, Caroline noticed something that made her blood run cold. A piece of straw in his hair, the kind that came from the stable loft, and a flush to his skin that suggested exertion or something else entirely. That evening, Caroline made an excuse to visit the stable, something about checking on her horse's feeding schedule. In the loft, she found evidence that someone had been there recently, a blanket spread over the hay, a book left behind, one of Catherine's French novels. The pieces came together with horrible clarity. Her sister, her identical twin, was conducting an affair with a slave, an affair that, if discovered, would destroy them both. Catherine would be ruined, cast out from society, the plantation would be seized, and Samuel would be killed, probably tortured first as an example to the other enslaved workers. Caroline's first instinct was horror, her second was rage, and her third was something she didn't expect. And couldn't fully acknowledge, even to herself, jealousy. Not because she cared about maintaining racial hierarchies or property boundaries, but because she had begun to notice Samuel too, his intelligence, his dignity despite his circumstances, the way he handled the complex work she gave him with effortless competence. She had told herself these were merely professional appreciations, the satisfaction of having found a valuable asset. But seeing evidence of Catherine's secret life with Samuel forced Caroline to confront feelings she had been suppressing for weeks. That night, Caroline did something she would later regret for the rest of her life. Instead of confronting Catherine, instead of sending Samuel away or reporting the situation to authorities, she decided to compete. The next week transformed. the Yansy plantation, into a pressure cooker of jealousy, manipulation, and barely concealed desperation. Caroline began manufacturing reasons to keep Samuel working late in the office, going over accounts that didn't need reviewing, asking him to teach her his method of organization. She started dressing more carefully when she knew she would see him, wearing her hair differently, speaking to him with a softness that was utterly unlike her usual crisp efficiency. Samuel recognized the danger immediately. Two white women, twin sisters who owned him, both showing interest that could only end in catastrophe. He tried to withdraw, to become invisible again, to revert to the submissive mask that kept enslaved people alive. But Caroline had power over his daily existence. She could assign him tasks, keep him late, send him on errands that ensured they were alone together. And Catherine, increasingly aware of her sister's attention to Samuel, became more reckless in her attempts to see him, more open in her affection, more desperate to claim what she saw as hers. On May 8th, Caroline did something extraordinary. She called Samuel into the office late at night after the house staff had retired, and she locked the door. For a long moment she simply looked at him, and Samuel stood frozen, certain this was the moment his life would end. Then Caroline spoke, her voice shaking slightly, the first time Samuel had ever heard uncertainty in her tone. "My sister has been meeting with you in the stable. Don't deny it. I have evidence." She paused, watching his face carefully. "I could have you whipped until you can't stand. I could sell you south to the sugar plantations where you'd be dead within 2 years. I could report this to the sheriff and watch you hang another pause longer this time. Or I could offer you something different." What Caroline proposed in that locked office was a transaction that revealed both the absolute corruption of the slavery system and the desperate measures a lonely, isolated woman might take. She would protect him from punishment for his involvement with Catherine. She would ensure his safety, improve his living conditions, perhaps even, she hinted carefully, consider his future freedom. In exchange, he would transfer his attentions to her. He would meet with her as he had met with Catherine. He would, in essence, become shared property between the twin sisters, though Caroline made clear she expected to be the primary beneficiary of the arrangement. Samuel had no choice, and both of them knew it. His consent was purchased with the threat of death and the faint hope of survival. He agreed to Caroline's terms because the alternative was unthinkable. For the next 2 weeks, Samuel found himself caught in an impossible situation. Catherine, unaware of Caroline's ultimatum, continued to seek him out, to speak with him in hushed voices about running away together, about freedom, about a life beyond Alabama that could never exist. Caroline, meanwhile, summoned him to the office with increasing frequency, demanding his attention, his time, his body. The careful distance she had initially maintained, the pretense of propriety, gradually eroded. She touched his hand when reviewing ledgers. She stood too close when discussing inventory. She made comments that were unmistakably personal rather than professional. The other enslaved workers in the house noticed, of course. They saw Samuel's increasing exhaustion, the tension that radiated from him, the way both white women watched him constantly. They whispered among themselves about the danger brewing, about how these situations always ended in blood. Old Dinah, who had worked in the Yansy house for 40 years, pulled Samuel aside in early May and spoke with the blunt honesty of someone who had seen too much tragedy. "Whatever's happening between you and those women, it's going to kill you," she said flatly. "White women and colored men, it always ends the same way. You need to do something wrong. Get yourself sold away before this explodes." But Samuel couldn't see a way out. If he tried to run, the dogs would find him within days. If he deliberately sabotaged his work to get sold, he might end up somewhere worse. And despite everything, despite the danger, despite the manipulation, despite the fundamental wrongness of the entire situation, he had developed genuine feelings for Catherine. Not the complicated mixture of fear and obligation he felt toward Caroline, but real affection for the woman who had first seen him as human, who had risked everything to speak with him as an equal. Catherine, meanwhile, had begun to realize her sister was also involved with Samuel. She noticed the way Caroline's eyes followed him, the way she found excuses to keep him working late, the subtle changes in Caroline's behavior. What should have been a warning instead ignited Catherine's competitive nature. The sisters had always competed for their father's approval, for social status, for everything. Now they were competing for Samuel, and neither seemed capable of recognizing how grotesque and dangerous the situation had become. On May 15th, Catherine confronted Samuel in the garden house, her voice sharp with accusation. "You've been spending time with Caroline. I can see it. Has she touched you?" Samuel's silence was answer enough. Catherine's face went pale, then flushed with anger. "She doesn't care about you. She sees you as property, an asset to exploit. I'm the one who sees you as a person. I'm the one who would risk everything for you, Miss Catherine," Samuel said carefully, using the formal address. Because even in private moments, the power dynamic could never be forgotten. "With respect, you can't risk what I risk. If this comes out, you'll be socially ruined. I'll be dead. Those aren't equivalent consequences." The truth of this statement hung between them. Catherine wanted to argue, to insist her feelings made them equals, but she couldn't. The plantation system that had given her wealth and status had also made true equality between them impossible. She could sympathize. She could rebel against the strictures of her society, but she couldn't change the fundamental reality that she was free and he was not, that her worst nightmare was exile from polite society while his was death. "Then let's leave," Catherine said suddenly, desperately. "We'll go north. I have jewelry I can sell. We'll get to Pennsylvania or Ohio. You'll be free there." They'll chase us," Samuel interrupted quietly. "Your sister won't let her property disappear. The sheriff will form a posy. They'll bring dogs, and when they catch us, when, not if, I'll hang and you'll be brought back in disgrace. Is that what you want?" Catherine had no answer. Her romantic vision of escape crumbled against the reality Samuel understood all too well. But instead of accepting defeat, her desperation deepened. If they couldn't leave, then she would find another way to claim what she saw as hers. That night, Catherine did something that would set the final tragedy in motion. She went to Caroline's bedroom and confronted her sister directly. The argument that followed was later recounted by Rose, a housegirl who overheard it from the hallway while bringing up evening tea. The twins' voices rose steadily, though the words were initially muffled. Then suddenly, Catherine's voice became clear and carrying. "You don't care about him. You just can't stand that I have something you don't." Caroline's response was colder, sharper. "I'm protecting you from your own stupidity. If I don't control this situation, people will find out. Do you want to see him lynched? Because that's what will happen when one of the field hands talks, when Henley notices, when any of our neighbors get suspicious. You're not protecting anyone but yourself. You want him because I want him. That's all this has ever been. Competing with me. Don't be ridiculous. He's property. Don't you dare." Catherine's voice dropped to something dangerous. "Don't you dare pretend this is about property management. I see how you look at him. I know what you're doing in that office late at night." There was a long silence. Then Caroline spoke, and Rose would later swear that she had never heard such coldness in a human voice. "Fine. You want to know the truth? Yes, I want him. Yes, I've taken him. And unlike you with your childish romantic fantasies, I understand what he actually is. Mine. My property purchased with my money to use as I see fit. You can play at being in love if it makes you feel better, but at the end of the day, I own him. You own him. He doesn't get a choice in this. That's the reality you're too foolish to accept." "Then we'll see who he chooses when given the chance," Catherine said. "We'll ask him directly, and we'll both honor his decision." Caroline laughed, a bitter sound. "You can't free a slave by asking his preference. The world doesn't work that way." "Then I'll free him legally. I'll draw up manumission papers tomorrow." "You'll do no such thing," Caroline said flatly. "You own half this plantation. I own half. That means you own half of Samuel. You can't free him without my consent, and I don't give it. He stays enslaved. He stays here. And if you try to change that, I'll have him sold. So far south you'll never see him again." The argument deteriorated from there, devolving into accusations and old grievances. Years of sibling rivalry suddenly focused on one man who had no power in the situation at all. Finally, Catherine stormed from the room, slamming the door hard enough to shake the house. The following morning, May 16th, Samuel was conspicuously absent from his usual duties. Caroline sent 3 different houseworkers to find him, each returning with the same message. He wasn't in his quarters, wasn't in the stable. wasn't anywhere on the property they could see. Virgil Henley was summoned, and a search was organized. Plantation workers combing through the fields, the woods along the river, the outbuildings. They found Samuel in the old cotton gin house, a building that hadn't been used since a newer gin was constructed the previous year. He was sitting on the floor back against the wall staring at nothing. When Henley grabbed him roughly and demanded to know why he'd abandoned his duties, Samuel didn't respond. He simply stood when pulled to his feet and allowed himself to be marched back to the main house without speaking a word. Caroline saw him in this state and felt something crack in her carefully controlled demeanor. She dismissed Henley and the others, then approached Samuel in the plantation office where he'd been left standing. "What's wrong with you? Why did you disappear?" Samuel looked at her, and Caroline would later tell the magistrate that his eyes held something she'd never seen in an enslaved person before. Not hatred, not fear, but complete resignation. "You can't force someone to choose between two people who own them," he said quietly. "There's no choice in that, just survival. We're no forcing," Caroline started, but Samuel cut her off. A boldness that would have gotten him whipped on most plantations. "Yes, you are, both of you. Miss Catherine thinks she's different because she talks to me like a person, but she still owns me. You think you're practical and honest about it, but you still own me, and now you're both angry because your property isn't behaving the way you want." He paused, seeming to wrestle with whether to continue, then clearly deciding he had nothing left to lose. "I can't be part of this anymore. I won't be. Sell me, whip me, kill me. I don't care, but I won't keep doing this." For a long moment, Caroline stared at him. Then, surprisingly, her expression softened into something almost like regret. "You're right," she said quietly. "This has become impossible. I'll arrange to sell you to a factory in Mobile. You'll be processed through and resold elsewhere. It's the safest option for everyone." But Catherine, who had been listening from the hallway, burst into the room. "You will not sell him. I won't allow it." "You don't have a choice," Caroline said, her voice hardening again. "I own half of him. That gives me the power to force a sale if I believe the asset has become disruptive to plantation operations. Any magistrate would agree with me. What happened next was documented by multiple witnesses. Catherine, in her desperation, made an offer that was both legally dubious and socially catastrophic. She proposed that she and Caroline divide all plantation assets, each taking complete ownership of their portion. Catherine would take Samuel as part of her share, free him immediately through manumission papers, and then marry him. They would leave Alabama, go north, where such marriages were recognized in some states, and never return. The silence that followed this announcement was absolute. The two houseworkers present, Rose and a young man named Isaac, stood frozen, understanding they were witnessing something that could get everyone in the room killed. Caroline's response was carefully controlled. "You've lost your mind. That proposal is illegal, immoral, and would destroy both of us." "The answer is no." "Then I'll take this to court," Catherine said. "I'll petition for division of property." You'll what?" Caroline interrupted. "Tell a judge you want to free and marry a slave. They'll commit you to an asylum for insanity or worse. They'll investigate why you're so attached to this particular piece of property, and then Samuel dies. Is that what you want?" Catherine had no answer to this. She stood trembling with rage and helplessness, tears streaming down her face, while her sister watched with an expression of pity and contempt. Samuel, caught between them, made a decision. "I'll choose," he said suddenly. "You want me to choose? I'll choose. Then this ends." Both sisters turned to look at him. "What?" Caroline said. "You asked me to choose between you. I choose Miss Catherine. She's the one who first saw me as human. If my choice means anything, if there's any possibility of something other than being property forever, I choose her." For a moment, hope flared in Catherine's eyes. Then Caroline smiled, a cold, terrible expression. "Your choice means nothing. You're a slave. You don't get to choose." Catherine stepped forward, her hand moving to her dress pocket, where she'd placed a small pistol earlier that morning, a wee pawn she'd taken from her father's study, intending to use it to protect herself and Samuel if they tried to run. Her hand closed around it, and in that moment she genuinely considered shooting her sister. Caroline saw the movement, recognized the shape of the weapon through the fabric, and her face went pale. "Catherine, don't give me ownership of Samuel," Catherine said, her voice shaking. "Sign over your half to me now. If you shoot me, you'll hang," Caroline said, "and Samuel will still be sold. Henley or the sheriff will insure it. You can't win this way." The standoff lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably less than a minute. Then Samuel spoke, his voice utterly calm. "Miss Catherine, put the gun away. Please, nothing good comes from this." Catherine looked at him, saw something in his expression, pleading or perhaps wisdom, and slowly removed her hand from her pocket. Empty. The moment of potential violence passed, but the damage was done. Everyone present knew how close they'd come to murder. Caroline straightened her dress, her composure returning, though her hands shook slightly. "I'm going to Montgomery tomorrow to speak with our lawyer about formally selling Samuel. This situation has become untenable. He'll be gone within a week." Catherine turned and walked from the room without another word. Samuel remained standing where he was, and Caroline couldn't quite meet his eyes as she told him to return to his quarters and remain there until she decided what to do with him. That evening, the entire social structure of the Yansy plantation began to fracture. Word of the confrontation spread through the enslaved quarters with the speed that gossip always travels. Hen people's lives depend on reading the moods and tensions of those who hold power over them. The field workers who had been kept separate from the house drama until now learned that two white women were fighting over a house slave, that guns had been drawn, that everything was falling apart. Virgil Henley heard the whispers and understood immediately how dangerous the situation had become. Enslaved workers who witnessed white people losing control, who saw the power structure destabilizing, might get ideas, might start thinking about rebellion or escape, might realize that the system that held them in bondage was more fragile than it appeared. Henley called a meeting with Caroline that evening, insisting something had to be done immediately. "That man needs to be made an example," Henley told Caroline in her office. "The others are watching. They're seeing weakness, seeing division. You need to reassert control." "I'm selling him," Caroline said. "That resolves the issue. Not quickly enough. He should be whipped tonight publicly. Send a message that insubordination gets punished." Caroline hesitated. She knew Henley was right from a plantation management perspective. Maintaining discipline through fear was standard practice. But the thought of ordering Samuel whipped after everything that had passed between them made her feel sick. "No," she said finally. "We'll handle this my way." Henley's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake, both you and your sister. This is what happens when women try to run plantations without a man's firm hand." The condescension in his voice sparked Caroline's anger. "You're dismissed, Mr. Henley. I'll call you if I need your services. After Henley..." I left. Caroline sat alone in the office trying to determine her next move. She had lost control of the situation, something she prided herself on never allowing. Her carefully ordered world was crumbling because she had let emotion override reason, because she had competed with her sister over a man who wasn't even free, because she had violated every principle she claimed to hold about property and propriety and the proper social order. While Caroline wrestled with her choices, Catherine was in her bedroom writing a letter. She had decided in the wake of the confrontation that if she couldn't free Samuel through legal channels, she would help him escape. She would provide money, supplies, information about the Underground Railroad contacts she'd heard whispered about in Montgomery's more radical circles. She would sacrifice everything, her inheritance, her position, her family, to give him a chance at freedom. In her letter, she detailed her plan. Samuel would leave that very night, heading north through the woods towards Selma, where a Quaker family was rumored to shelter runaways. Catherine would create a distraction, claim Samuel had attacked her, give him enough of a head start, that the pursuing party might lose the trail. It was a desperate, poorly conceived plan, with almost no chance of success. But Catherine had moved beyond rational thought into the realm of romantic martyrdom. She saw herself as the heroine of one of her French novels, sacrificing everything for love, defying society's cruel laws. She didn't fully grasp or chose to ignore that her sacrifice wouldn't save Samuel, would likely only ensure his death was more drawn out and painful when he was in. inevitably recaptured. Catherine sent word to Samuel through Rose, asking him to meet her in the garden house at midnight. The message included instructions to bring nothing, to tell no one, to be ready to leave forever. Samuel received this message in his quarters, a small room he shared with 2 other houseworkers. He read Catherine's note, written in her elaborate script on expensive paper, and felt despair settle over him like a weight. He understood what Catherine could not or would not accept. Escape was impossible. The plantation dogs would track him within hours. Every white person in the county would be watching for a runaway slave authorized to shoot on sight. Even if by some miracle he made it to Selma, the Quaker family might not exist, or might not risk their lives for a stranger, or might have already been discovered and arrested for aiding runaways. But Samuel also understood that if he didn't go along with Catherine's plan, she would be devastated, might do something even more reckless. And there was a small irrational part of him that wanted to believe escape was possible, that Catherine's love could somehow overcome the brutal machinery of slavery. He spent the hours before midnight talking quietly with Isaac, the young man who worked in the house. Isaac had been born on the Yansy plantation, had known nothing but this life, and he listened to Samuel's situation with the weary wisdom of someone who had seen these dramas play out before. "These white women and their games," Isaac said, shaking his head. "They think they can control everything, including how we feel. Miss Catherine acts like she's doing you a favor, like helping you run is noble, but when you get caught, and you will get caught, she'll be safe in this house while you're being torn apart by dogs or hanging from a tree." "I know," Samuel said quietly, "but what choice do I have? If I refuse her plan, I'm still being sold away. If I try to run, at least there's a chance, a tiny chance, but a chance." Isaac considered this. There's always another choice. The choice enslaved people have always had when pushed too far. Samuel understood what Isaac meant without him saying it directly. Resistance, not escape, not submission, but direct confrontation with the system itself. It was a choice that always ended in death. But sometimes people reached a point where death on their own terms seemed preferable to continued degradation. "I'm not ready for that," Samuel said. "None of us are," Isaac replied, "until suddenly we are." As midnight approached, the Yansy plantation settled into uneasy silence. Caroline, exhausted from the day's confrontations, had finally fallen asleep in her bedroom, though her rest was troubled by dreams of conflict and loss. Catherine lay awake, dressed in dark clothes suitable for riding, a packed bag beside her bed. She had decided to go with Samuel after all, had convinced herself their love could overcome any obstacle. Virgil Henley sat in his cottage near the slave quarters, drinking whiskey and cleaning his pistol, convinced that everything happening at the plantation was the result of weak female leadership. And Samuel prepared to meet Catherine, to participate in her doomed plan because he had run out of better options. What none of them knew was that Rose, the house girl who had been carrying messages between the sisters and Samuel, had become increasingly frightened by what she was witnessing. Rose had a husband in the quarters, had children she was terrified of losing if the plantation fell apart or was sold. She had seen what happened when white people's conflict spilled over onto enslaved workers. Everyone suffered, the guilty and innocent alike. So Rose made a decision that would determine the fate of everyone at the Yansy plantation. She told Virgil Henley everything about the affair, about both sisters competing for Samuel, about the escape plan Catherine had arranged for that very night. Henley listened to Rose's whispered account in his cottage, his expression growing darker with each detail. When she finished, he stood abruptly. "Go back to your quarters. Say nothing to anyone about this conversation. If anyone asks, you've been asleep all evening." Rose fled, terrified she had made everything worse. Henley, meanwhile, began to make his own plans. He understood that what was happening at the Yansy plantation was beyond his ability to control through normal disciplinary measures. The situation required more drastic intervention. He would gather a group of trusted men, overseers from neighboring plantations, men he'd worked with before, men who understood how to handle situations when enslaved people got uppity or when white women needed to be protected from their own foolishness. They would catch Samuel in the act of running, would deal with him in the permanent way that served as a message to every other enslaved person in Dallas County. and they would quietly ensure the Yansy sisters understood the consequences of losing control. At 11:45 p.m. on May 22, 1852, Samuel left his quarters and began walking toward the garden house. The night was humid, moonless, the air thick with the scent of magnolia and the distant promise of rain. He moved quietly past the main house, past the dark windows where Caroline slept, toward the small building where Catherine waited. He didn't know that Henley and 6 other men were already positioned in the shadows watching his approach. He didn't know that Caroline had woken from a nightmare and was even now standing at her bedroom window, watching the grounds with a feeling of dread she couldn't explain. He didn't know that what he thought was a private escape attempt was actually walking directly into an ambush that would end in catastrophe. Samuel reached the garden house and pushed open the door. Catherine stood inside, a lantern in her hand casting golden light across her face. She smiled when she saw him, a smile of hope and determination and desperation. "You came," she whispered. "I was afraid you wouldn't come." "I came," Samuel replied. And then, because some part of him needed her to understand the reality of what they were attempting. "But Miss Catherine, you need to know this won't work. We won't make it. This ends badly no matter what happens next." Catherine stepped closer to him, close enough that the lantern light caught the tears in her eyes. The violence spread like wildfire through the quarters as more people rushed into the chaos, old grudges, fear, and fresh horror all colliding at once. Catherine, still clutching Samuel's body, looked like she had completely lost her mind. Her hands were shaking, her dress stained with dirt and blood, but her eyes were fixed on one thing: revenge. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the pistol she had earlier pointed at Caroline, and without hesitation she started firing. But she wasn't shooting at the enslaved workers. She turned the weapon toward Virgil Henley and his men. 2 of them dropped before they even understood what was happening. For a brief moment, Catherine stood there like a storm unleashed, until one of Henley's men fired back. The bullet struck her in the chest, and she collapsed beside Samuel, her body falling into the Alabama dirt as if the land itself swallowed her rage. Caroline screamed, not out of anger, but out of panic and desperation. She tried to stop it. She tried to pull people back, tried to break the madness apart before it consumed everyone. But she never got the chance. A shot rang out from somewhere in the smoke and confusion, and Caroline was caught in the crossfire. She dropped just a few feet away from her sister, their blood mixed together in the soil. The twins, identical in life, died within minutes of each other, both of them, in their own twisted and broken way, trying to claim, protect, or possess a man they never had the right to love. Not the way they wanted, not under a system built on ownership. By the time it ended, by the time neighboring plantations arrived with reinforcements, and by the time the sheriff from Cahaba finally rode in with a posse, 17 people were dead. Caroline and Catherine Yansy, Virgil Henley, 4 of Henley's men, Samuel, and 9 other enslaved workers, some who fought back in resistance, and some who were simply standing in the wrong place when the bullets started flying. The Yansy plantation didn't survive that night either. Flames rose into the sky as the property burned. Some claimed the enslaved workers set the fires on purpose in the chaos, as a final act of rebellion. Others insisted it was accidental, that dropped torches and scattered embers caught the cotton stores and spread too fast to control. But no matter how it started, the ending was the same. The mansion, the gin house, the outbuildings, everything that had represented generations of Yansy wealth and power was swallowed by fire. In the aftermath, the official story was not just written, it was manufactured, carefully shaped to protect what remained of the social order. The magistrate's report, filed 3 weeks later, claimed that Samuel had attempted to assault Catherine Yansy and that Virgil Henley had righteously intervened. It stated that the enslaved workers revolted in support of Samuel and that the Yansy twins died as innocent victims of a slave rebellion. The report made no mention of the jealousy, the obsession, the rivalry between the sisters, or the truth that Catherine had willingly invited Samuel to meet her. Those details were too dangerous, too explosive, too likely to raise questions about the foundations of plantation society itself, and while the white families of the county worked to bury the truth, The surviving enslaved workers paid the real price. More than 100 men, women and children from the Yansy plantation were sold at auction to settle the estate's debts. Families were ripped apart, children torn away from parents, husbands separated from wives, an entire community destroyed and scattered across the deep south like ashes in the wind. The land itself was eventually purchased by a cotton factor from Montgomery, who built a new home on the property and worked the fields with newly purchased enslaved workers, people who had no idea what kind of nightmare had unfolded on that soil. But the truth has a way of refusing to die completely. It survives in whispers, in fragments, in the things people try hardest to hide. Testimonies given to the magistrate were sealed away for decades, locked from the public eye for 73 years, and when those documents were finally opened in 1925, they revealed a much darker and far more disturbing story. Survivors like Rose and Isaac and others who witnessed the confrontations described what really happened: two sisters consumed by jealousy and possessiveness, a man trapped in the cruelty of slavery, and a system so violent that it turned human emotions into weapons. For generations in Dallas County, the story of the Yansy plantation became a cautionary tale, but not in the way it should have been. It wasn't whispered as a warning about the evil of slavery. That conversation would take another century to truly begin. Instead, people twisted it into a warning about women running plantations, about maintaining racial hierarchies, about what happened when unnatural relationships were allowed to develop. Only much later would historians begin to see the real lesson of that May night. A lesson about the violence of a system built on human ownership, about the impossibility of love inside slavery, about the way power corrupts even those who might otherwise have been capable of compassion. So now I want to ask you, do you believe jealousy and obsession can really lead to a tragedy this massive? Or do you think the real monster here was the system that made this kind of horror possible in the first place? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to mention which country you're watching from, because I love reading where the Black Rite Stories family is tuning in from around the world. And if you enjoyed this dark, forgotten piece of history and want more stories like this, make sure you subscribe to my channel, Black Rite Stories, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves chilling historical mysteries. Until the next story, remember this: the most terrifying history is the history we chose to forget.